artificial intelligence uh, helps in enabling some sensor technology and how this can be useful for future technologies. So that's broadly what I'll be discussing about. And this is based off on a recent paper of ours, a paper that has just been accepted, and it is even yet to get the page numbers. So it's fresh out of the oven, so to say. So all of us are aware that today's world is a hot, crowded, and hungry world. It's hot because of global warming. We are all aware of the severe crisis that is happening in terms of winter, unexpected winter in southern USA, in the Texas region. How Europe is freezing right in some countries where they have never seen snowfall, and the heat being very high in summers in India is something that we all know, and that added to the fact that the global population is increasing means that we don't have enough food being produced. Because if you look at the chart to the left, it shows to you that only about 1.4 billion people work in the field of agriculture, and they have to feed the rest of the pie chart, which is a tremendous task. Um, so I remember during the inauguration, Professor R.P. Tiwari was mentioning about how it is important for us to work on issues that are specific to the society. So this is the angle in which I'll be discussing today, which is can we do something to mitigate this issue of food shortage, global food shortage as it is called. The global land usage world over is that we know that about 29% of the globe is land, of which only 71% is habitable, and of which 50% is agriculture, and so on and so forth. I don't have to go into the details of this, but the fact of the matter is, in the process of making these concrete jungles of buildings and of cities and towns, we are taking away a lot of land, and this can't be helped given that the population is increasing. So the question to ask is there a way to mitigate this, and are there alternative sources? So what could be the, sorry, is there something that I need to look at? Yeah, thank you. So what are the causes for global food crisis? Poverty, people don't have enough money to buy food, food shortage, war and conflict in every region where there's war or conflict. The amount of food that goes into the population is very less. Climate change, poor nutrition. You might get food, but it doesn't have enough nutritional values. Poor public policy in distributing these food. Economy, gender inequality, which we are all aware of, at least in the Indian context, that women get to eat last, and they get what is left over. So there is a lot of inequality when it comes to food. They don't get enough food, and food wastage. So I will be concentrating on food wastage. So that's the topic that I'm going to be looking at. So according to the World Food Program, one third of all food produced, that is over 1.3 billion tons, is never consumed. It's wasted. And given the fact that there is a huge population which goes hungry, it's almost criminal, if I might use that word, that so much of food goes to waste. So there is something called a food recovery hierarchy. How do you actually take care of this particular problem? The food recovery hierarchy prioritizes actions that can be taken to prevent food wastage. Um, and the top ones are the most high priority, and the bottom ones being less priority. So if we have a look at this, you can see that the topmost is reduction in wastage. That is high priority. Whereas the others are redistribution of food to, like, if you think there is a wastage, you take it and give it to somebody who's hungry. So that's redistribution to feed the hungry, or recycle it as fodder to animals, or use them to create biofuels. And the last, which is not preferred, is to either incinerate them or to use them in landfills, both of which are not really, the best options. You would rather reduce wastage than to go and put them into landfills, right? So dairy food seems to be a good alternative, if not a complete alternative, at least a supplement to this, to the main food that we have, in terms of both nutrition because of the protein power that is there in the milk products, and in a sense to mitigate the food crisis. Because milk composition has a large percentage, as you can see from the pie chart. In addition to carbohydrates and fats, it's got a large protein content. So dairy food and ingredients, think like milk and cheese and yogurt and everything else, can help feed those who are food insecure because they have high nutritional value, and they can be consumed easily. So this is the area that we were looking into. There is this research article that I have come across, which states that the reference, sorry, the reference is, sorry about this, it's this way, that in the year 2050, we will need 100% more food, 70% of which must come from efficiency improving technologies, because we have hit a limit as far as genetic modification of crop is concerned. We have hit a limit as far as trying to actually increase the produce is concerned. The amount of land that is available is going down, so we need to think smart and we need to bring in technology. And that is where a lot of our work would be useful. So, how does technology come to the rescue? Less than 2% of all produce is actually organic, that is, without any technological advances. So, we cannot say that technology should not be used, because that's almost a non event. Where can technology be used? It can either be used in genetic modifications, or in practices, or in products, right? So you can include your technology in any one of these, and there are things like drones and sensors and internet of things. I'll be discussing about the sensors and internet of things in detail, and also having advanced analytical sensors in order to improve the efficiency. Because I'll be discussing more about dairy, let me just show you some statistics which show that technological intervention actually has reduced the water usage on dairies by 65% between 1944 and 2007, by just implementing latest technology in trying to sense what is required on a dairy farm and how to use it, etc. It has reduced land usage by as much as 90%, which is really fascinating. Manual production, it's a lot about methane gases, and what is happening there is again 76% less, and carbon footprint is 63% less. So for anybody who thinks that technological interventions are wrong, because we also go through these fads of people saying that everything is organic and we need to go organic and don't use tech. Not true completely. We need to know how to use the technology, because it actually helps tackling the global environmental crisis and reducing the carbon footprint. So it's technology is not wrong. It's wrong if you misuse it. Right. So this I know all of you are aware of, but just as a matter of continuity, I would like to emphasize this once. That is, there have been various industrial revolutions happening in the history of humankind. Each one of this which has contributed to mitigating the ill effects of raising population. The first industrial revolution between 1760 and 1840 led to mass production by replacing handmade products with machines, and the power of steam and water was harnessed. The second industrial revolution, which came between 1871 and 1914, used the intensive rail and road network, and there was electrification, which meant that goods and commodities could move across very easily, and there was an increase in the distribution of the products. The third industrial revolution was basically the digital revolution, which again helped in a large amount of information being gathered and then trying to reduce the ill effects. The fourth IR, which is what we are discussing right now, is the so-called, it's called IE 4.0, and it's the large-scale machine-to-machine communication, which is basically your Internet of Things. So machines talk to machines. It's no longer man talking with a machine, but machine talking to a machine, and that leading to an improved efficiency in the products. So from this paper, the role of science and technology and innovation in ensuring food security, there is this nice statement which says that big data and Internet of Things can be harnessed for a number of agricultural applications, including farmer decision making and precision farming and insurance. Let me give you a couple of examples to let you know what we mean by this. So if you look at dairy farming, I'm just, I'm using these two words, agriculture and dairy farming, a bit interchangeably, but I think you understand the context in which I'm telling them. In a modern dairy, there are multiple sensors that are placed on the cow. So you have the ear tags so that you can track the animal, especially if you have large scale farms, you know where the animal is, and there are the uh, sensors in every part of the cow to keep a track of everything from the milk to the production to the medicines which are given to the health conditions. Uh, and this data is collected nowadays remotely, and that helps the farmer to actually monitor each individual cow and see that it works in the sense it produces milk to the optimal efficiency of both the animal and the farm. So these are already implemented in most of the dairy farms. So what kind of sensors are there? This is from the Journal of the Dairy Science in 2010. So you can see that there are various aspects of dairy farming that need to be monitored continuously. And of this, you have everything from electrical conductivity measurements to ultrasonic electromagnetic sensors. I think Dr. Lalit spoke about electromagnetic sensors. You have biosensors, chemical sensors. You know when you're testing the progesterone, and so each part of this has a large number of sensors that are already incorporated, and also there is a need to improve the efficiency. So there is image analysis which is done when you have abnormal milk, and this is mostly the region in which we are working. So I'll be discussing more about this. So the machine to machine communication and the Internet of Things is something like, you first tag uh, the cow or the dairy animal, as I was discussing. There are multiple sensors that are put on the cattle, and they're monitored by the farmers, and the milk is produced. Now you have sensors in the carriage to ensure that the temperature is optimal, the bacterial content and other things are optimal, and then there is processing again until you come and until the milk gets delivered home. Now what happens is, typically in the Internet of Things in dairy, the monitoring stops at this level when it comes home. But we understand that a lot of wastage happens after this. Very often we are not sure if the milk is good or spoiled, and that's where a lot of things go waste. So what we in my work are trying to do is to take this one step forward and see if we can actually uh, implement some sensors after the milk is delivered to your house. So Internet of Things in dairy usually stops at the delivery point, and this is the supply chain of the dairy product that is typically done anywhere in the world. So we have these various sensors that are typically used. Um, Milk conductance, conductivity sensors, pH meters, including monitoring of temperature, milk temperature, color, cell count, rapid tests. I mean, now we know what RTs are, thanks to COVID. So RTs, rapid tests for progesterone, etc., to ensure that we don't get any excessive hormones built into the end consumer. Milk fat protein sensors, lumination measurement, animal weight, eating time, etc., etc. This is the amount of moisture in the hay, so on and so forth. So there is no dearth for sensors in the dairy technology. They're already been implemented in a large amount. But it is not enough if we have a base sensor. And I think as people from either physics or EC background, you know the difference between a base sensor and a smart sensor. A smart sensor is a base sensor plus the ability to process the data and to transmit the conclusions from it so that decisions can be made. A base sensor simply makes a measurement. So we are looking not just for base sensors, but we're looking for smart sensors. So the current development of sensors is purely based on mathematical models in which we need to know the parameters exactly. If I want, many of us work, even I have worked on these. That is, you have the simulations where you work on sensor models and then try to implement them. Anybody who has worked on any kind of a simulation knows that my simulation is as good as the inputs I give it. If I don't give enough correct inputs, I mean, junk in, junk out. Like if I don't give correct inputs, I can always get some answer which is not right. But there are times when uncertainties and variations which are impossible to anticipate will come up. That you can't guess everything that's going to happen in a real life or on the field, and that will make the sensor not to work to the extent that you want it to work. Now, when you combine these sensors with artificial intelligence, then these uncertainties and variations can be addressed because I'll be discussing this in a little bit of detail. But what happens when you use artificial intelligence is you don't really have to know what the parameters are, but you can model without really knowing them based on the output. So if I make observations for long enough, I can make use of it to formulate the process without really understanding these uncertainties. So this is going to be the future technology as far as sensors is concerned, because the ability to predict is something that comes with the territory of artificial intelligence. So we'll be discussing how AI can be used along with sensor technology to have smart sensors. So just as a point of reference to tell you what's happening, you can see the number of documents that talk about diary and artificial intelligence. This is a work that was done by some people. So you can see that in the title, the number of times machine learning, diary, agriculture, all these random forests, which is one of the techniques of artificial intelligence, clustering, neural networks, etc., have been used. Uh, and this is also based on, this is Google Scholar data from 2015, and searches were performed in quite recently. So this is to tell you how important the entire field is and how active it is. Not just important, but it's active because people are working in this area. Just in this. Yeah. So this is from the journal called Animals 2020. So what exactly is artificial intelligence? Many of you might be aware, but this is just a small recap for those of you who might not be fully aware. So artificial intelligence, like as all of us know, is a subset of computer science. Now, in an artificial intelligence domain, a program is written that can sense, reason, and adapt. When you start implementing it, you have what is called machine learning. And machine learning is essentially having algorithms which perform, so that there's an improvement in the performance, and the performance improves more if you give it more data. So if you give it enough number of data points, it can predict better. This is almost the way humans learn. And okay, let me just complete this and let me come back. Then there is the deep learning, which is basically a subset of machine learning in which multi-layer neural networks learn from a vast amount of data. Right. So for any of these to work, you need to have a large amount of data. So I was just saying that this is almost like how human beings learn and adapt, because as a child, uh, we learn by mimicking others. So if you see the same thing many times, repetitive ideas or repetitive behavior, then it gets imbibed into us, and we understand that this has to be done in a particular way. So this is why discipline becomes important when you have a child, because the child only understands by repetitive exposure to a pattern, right? And similarly, the algorithms also respond to these repetitive, exposures to patterns. So this is pattern recognition in that sense. So artificial intelligence started as a subject in the 1950s. Machine learning in the 1980s, and deep learning. It's mostly now, like in the last 10 years or so, that it has really picked up. And so we'll be discussing a lot about. We'll be discussing about deep learning and how we are going to be using it. So when you have a system which has machine learning implemented into it, what it can do is it can learn. It can learn from the data that you give it. It can predict based on the learning, and hence it can improve whatever parameter you're trying to improve. So machine learning essentially is this combination of learning, predicting, improving. Improving, remember, always implies a feedback. Like in any other electronic circuit, if you need a system to optimize and to have a better efficiency, you need a feedback. So this feedback is something that is inbuilt into some of the machine learning algorithms, depending on which algorithm you use, but this is the way it works. So quickly moving on to what we are studying. So machine learning itself, the algorithms of machine learning fall into three categories, three broad categories. They are either unsupervised learning or supervised learning, or what is called reinforcement learning. So in supervised learning, you tell that if you see A, it means B. And they have a round face, the other one has a longer face. So learning, one of the major applications of supervised learning is image classification. And this is what we have done in classification. I'll leave the rest of it for you to see. So supervised learning, the input features and the output labels are defined. So what comes as an input and what goes as an output. In unsupervised learning, the data set is unlabeled and the goal is to discover hidden relationships. And in reinforcement learning, some of the feedback, some form of a feedback loop is present. And there is a need to optimize some parameters. So this is the basic classification. Now remember that like in any other circuitry, you can either have analogous data or you can have digital data. You can either have discrete or continuous, so to say. And so in each one of them, it has a different name. So if I have the supervised learning, we are not going into the feedback part because feedback is slightly more complicated. So if I look at the systems without feedback, the supervised and the unsupervised learning, and I have my data could either be discrete or it could be continuous. So the discrete data, uh, supervised learning is classification or categorization. Uh, if it is unsupervised learning, it's called clustering. If it's continuous data and you're having the supervised learning, it is called regression, and unsupervised is dimensional data reduction. These are technical methods. As the name suggests, you have ways of working on it. I am not going really deep into the algorithms at this moment. So some key points which show the importance of machine learning is that there is a rapid increment in the production of the data or whatever you're looking at. So it helps you to actually have better efficiency. You can solve complex problems which are difficult for the human mind to work on or for the human being to work on. Decision making in various sectors, including finance, becomes very easy because, see, sometimes, especially if you're talking of an agrarian crisis or a dairy, running a dairy, you need to know whether you want to invest in something or not. So, how do you know? And the question we were asking is, how do I know whether I should discard the milk or I should keep it? Is it good or is it bad? Right. So that decision making ability, when the human mind cannot really make a decision. See, humans can make the decision after the event has happened. Can I make a decision slightly before that? And that is where these entire artificial intelligence helps us in finding hidden patterns. That's something that we really, this is what we call as an intuitive power in the human beings, and that's what these networks do. So the idea is to find hidden patterns and extract very useful information from the data, which would have been otherwise difficult for a human to be understanding. So the features of machine learning are that it uses data to detect various patterns in a given data set. It can learn from past data and improve automatically. It's data driven. Your machine learning is going to be as good as the amount of data that you give it, amount of correct data that you give it. And machine learning is much similar to data mining, as it also involves a lot of data. In data mining, you simply extract an information. Here, the decision-making ability also happens. Right. I'm going to stop for a second, and I would like to know if things are okay till now, or are there any questions? Just to know that we are all on the same page. Can I get some feedback from some of you whether it's okay till now, or do you have any questions? Everything okay? Okay, thank you. Maybe a couple of more responses and I can go back. Okay, wonderful. So long as we are on the same page, I'm happy. So let me go back to this. Thank you. Thanks for the feedback. So now I'm moving on to the work that we have been doing, which is about milk. Right? Milk, as we all know, is one of the highest consumed food products world over. Milk has various proteins and fats, and it's all has a lot of water. The casein is the protein that actually holds the structure together, and its stickiness is what is responsible for very many of milk's properties, and also its importance as the food product, both casein and whey, whey protein. So the milk structure, if you look just with the human eye, it looks like an opaque liquid. If I do a 1,000-fold magnification, I will see fat emulsions, fat globules. I'll see the fat that's there. And if I do a 10,000 x magnification, I will see that every fat globule is surrounded by the protein casein micelles. Micelles are simply things that all these molecules which self-assemble into a tight structure. In fact, maybe I can even I'm sorry, I just forgot that it's not a predominantly to this. Yeah. I think quickly I'll just show you on a whiteboard. So, yeah. So whenever I have a molecule, a micelle is when these molecules come together by themselves and form structures. So it can either be that way, this is a head and that's a tail, or the heads could be going away. So this is actually an inverse micelle and this is a micelle. So they come together, and this is because of the intermolecular interactions that happen between the molecules. So all these caseins would form these kind of structures, and that is what you are seeing in this particular figure here. So whatever you're seeing here are the casein micelles that are sticking to the fat. Now, if anybody has had milk from a cow at home, like basically unhomogenized, you know that sometimes you get these globules of fat into your mouth. Whereas if you drink the milk from a packet that has been delivered to you, it feels smooth. That's because all these larger particles have been broken down into smaller ones. There's a homogenization, and what you get in at the end of it is what is called an oil and water emulsion. So oil and water emulsion basically contains of fat globules which are between 1 and 2 micrometers, casein micelles which are between 0.05 and 0.25 micrometers, lactose, whey proteins, and small concentrations of vitamins and minerals. So that is the generic structure of milk, and it's a very fascinating liquid if you look at it from a basic physics point of view. So if you have a fat difference, this is how your particle sizes change. Whole milk, skim milk, the volume density versus the size varies. So no two milk packets are going to be the same, right? And that's the reason why so much of homogenization is done before the milk is delivered to you, so that there is some uniformity in the milk that is delivered. Right. This is just the basics of what gets delivered. So what we have done, we meaning my research scholar Ashwini and myself, we have worked with commercial milk because we needed the homogenization. We had worked on a different fat percentage, although today I will be talking only about the 4.5%. And we have looked at milk undergoing three different processes. The processes that we have studied are lactic coagulation, that is basically making dahi. Okay, staling, that milk spoils, and dilution, which is one of the biggest adulterant in the milk industry after processing. So these were the three effects that we studied experimentally, and in all these three cases, what we did was to study the pH, because the entire process of milk and its transformation is pH dependent. One thing that I would like to share here is that there is something very interesting about milk. Milk in its raw form is something that gets spoiled very quickly. We all know this. I mean, I'm just saying what we already know. But milk also has this ability that if you process it in the right way, its shelf life becomes very large. Think about cheese, think about dahi, think about buttermilk, think about ghee. Once you make a ghee, it stays there for years, right? So milk has this ability that it can spoil in a day and also stay for a long time depending on how you process it. And that is what we are trying to look at. When you talk about food prices and then having milk replace some of the products, what you would really like to know is if you can increase the shelf life, and that is in itself reducing the wastage, right? So that was the aim in which with which we were looking at this. So we did a pH analysis, and I've shown you already that the particle size matters. So we were looking at the particle size. To measure the particle size and its interactions, we look at what is called the zeta potential. I'm not going to go into the details of these. This is not relevant to the current talk, but just to give you an idea of the kind of work we do. Dielectric properties and confocal laser scanning microscopy. This is what I'll be discussing. And then we also looked at study of the droplet drying patterns. So this has been the overall work that has been done over the last 4 5 years. It's taken us quite some time. So today's talk is basically about using machine learning and droplet drying and analyzing the patterns using artificial intelligence. So we have dilution where the micelle size, I just told you what the micelles are. And when you pour water, the micelle size becomes smaller. You have staling where it's basically known to be a three-stage process. Staling happens in three stages, and there is no inoculum. You're not adding an external agent with bacteria, because when you add an inoculum, which is what happens in coagulation when you form the heat, you have a control over the bacteria that you're implanting. So staling is the runaway effect, and you don't know what bacteria is there. So it internally builds up. Either it is from the milk or from the environment, and it occurs in three stages. Whereas coagulation, when we say coagulation here, we mean paneer, we mean cheese, we mean curd. These are different ways of looking at it. One is rennet based, the other is lactobacillus acidophilus based. So it can happen in 3 or 5 stages. So we have taken these three cases and then tried to see. We have done the typical dahi jamai that we do in our homes for our coagulation cases. So each one of this is a complex process. This is just about, just to give you the complexity of the entire thing, I have put this graph from one of our papers from last year. This tells you the dielectric spectroscopy and how we were able to identify each one of these stages of the 5-stage in the coagulation process. You can ignore the text here. It's just an explanation. We were able to actually predict the onset of each one of these stages about half an hour to 1 hour before any other technique, because typically people use pH measurements. We found that by using dielectric studies, we are able to predict it earlier. So this was one, but we were still not happy. There was a bit of, we wanted to have a better efficiency in trying to identify these stages and patterns, and so that's the reason we took it forward. What happens with dielectric, the reason we looked at dielectric is because many of the industrial processes have a vector network analyzer as a part of their production line. So at the end, they always make a measurement. So if you have a single vector network analyzer, you could be looking at this dielectric spectrum, and then you know which stage it is. So it's a very easy way of doing this in a assembly line method. So let me come to what happens when you put a drop of liquid on a solid surface, because that is the work that I'm discussing in this particular paper, which is droplet drying mechanisms. Right. So when you have a drop of liquid sitting on a surface of a solid, it forms what is called a three-phase contact line. So basically the ring that is formed with a drop. So there's a drop sitting, and then it forms a ring, and that ring is a three-phase contact line. This is a balance between uh, the three surface tensions, the solid liquid, the liquid vapor, and the solid vapor surface tensions. All three of them balance themselves on that line, and so you have an equilibrium structure. And once such a structure is formed, if you allow for the liquid to evaporate, it can evaporate in various modes. What are the different modes? Either the line is pinned, but the contact angle comes down, which is the first one. So there is a drop that is formed, the line is pinned, and then slowly the height of the drop falls. Or the drop size itself reduces, which means the deepened contact line, the line deepens and it starts moving. Or you can have a decrease in both, like the height and the width both collapse at the same time. Although it sounds simple in saying that it's either the height that reduces or the width that reduces, the fact is these are two different physical phenomena. And there's a lot of instabilities that, if you remember from either your first year physics or mechanical engineering papers in hydrodynamics, there are a lot of instabilities that are there. And all these instabilities occur in this such a drop. So it's a highly complex phenomena that's happening there. So we are asking a question, instead of having a pure drop of water, like, a pure drop of liquid like water, what if there are particles present in that? It really complicates the matter even more. And what happens then is either, you can have various kind of patterns that are formed. This is famously called the coffee stain effect, because if you have a drop of coffee fall anywhere, it will not dry uniformly. You will be left with a ring-like structure. And so this goes by the name, this effect goes by the name of a coffee stain effect. And you have a circulatory effect within the drop because of surface tension, that's called a Marigoni flow. So there are two things that are happening. Again, let me just quickly. So when I have a drop of liquid put on a solid surface, there is one is like there is a movement of the drop, which is based on the equilibration of the surface tensions. But there is also, because there is a surface tension or temperature gradient, there is a movement within this. So this is called a Marigoni effect, and this is a surface tension effect. So what you see is a balance between these two effects, and they form very unique patterns. Uh, if I have particles all over the place, I will get a uniform pattern. If there is a if the particles raise to the surface and then the liquid evaporates, you will have this kind of a deposition. So the deposition really depends on where the particles are, right? So it's a diffusion limited process, and what you have is a balance between the particles trying to stick to the surface, which is called a self-pinning, versus a capillary action, which is trying to push them outward. It's okay if you don't understand the whole thing, but I think it's not too difficult. So, like I said, you have a coffee stain formation or a uniform deposition, depending on whether the particles are moving out and they have already come to the edge, or they're still stuck in the middle, giving a uniform deposition. So you have an initial drop periphery. If you look at the droplet that rise, you have droplet center, which is so, okay. Let me not go into the details of this, because that's really not relevant. But what you can see is, depending on the temperature, the surface tension, the concentration, the number, there is so much of complexity that goes into a single droplet that rise. This should tell you the complexity of the image that we get when we look at the image of a droplet drying. So you have Maragoni flow, osmotic pressure driven flow, thermocapillarity, so on and so forth. Just impressing upon you that this is a highly complex process. So the coffee ring effect is formed as a result of the capillary flow, and this is observed when the dispersed particles in the droplet are deposited on the contact line. So they all come to the edge and they're deposited there. Where when the particles are pinned to the contact line, the fluid begins to flow from the central portion on to the edges. So the fluid literally pushes the particles to the edges and then it evaporates, leaving the ring. Whereas a Maragoni flow, on the other hand, is driven by surface tension gradients. And because of that, there is a reverse flow that happens, and that tries to compensate for the coffee stain effect. Now, the patterns could also, there is one more complexity, which is whether it's a constant contact radius or constant contact angle, the patterns, I have already discussed this, whether these edges are fixed, in which case the radius is fixed, or the angle is fixed, or there's a combination of both, or it's random. So depending on any one of these, and each one of these depends on many, many, many parameters, such as the nature of substrate, the nature of the liquid, the temperature at which you're working, the particles, the number of particles, the kind of particles. So there are a million parameters. So every coffee stain that you get is a function of, just imagine writing it out as a mathematical equation. It's going to be a function of a dozen parameters, and you add complexities to it, like turbulences and like instabilities and so on and so forth. So next time when you look at a drop that's drying, please appreciate the complexity. Just spend a minute to look at the beauty of it. So coffee stain effect, here I have just listed out all the parameters that could affect it. Aragonic convection, pH of the suspension, particle size, shape, particle concentration, substrate wettability, substrate temperature, relative humidity, etc., etc. This list is pretty large. So just before I go to the actual data, I have one last diagram to tell you the kind of patterns that you can get in a coffee stain effect. So I could just get a coffee ring. I could get a uniform pattern when you have fast evaporation or a smooth substrate or ellipsoidal molecules. I could have a combination depending on the humidity levels. I could have crystal patterns. I could have fractal effects when you have salts. You could have crack patterns that are seen in blood, dual rings, concentric rings, if you have more than one kind of particles. Or you can have a stick-slip effect where the drop is sticking and then suddenly it slips, moves a little, then gets stuck again, moves, so on. And like it's a jerky movement. And you can also have dotted lines. So I think between this slide and this, you can understand the complexity of a pattern formed by a droplet that dries, especially a colloidal drop, meaning a drop which has particles present in it. So I'll just quickly take you through the three processes that we were studying, which is dilution. Okay, I still have time. Which is basically dilution, coagulation, and staling. So the patterns that are formed, these data are for 4.5 fat percentage. So we have an outer ring form, a uniformly packed region, and an empty space or a bump right at the center. This is what we observe. And the outer ring is because of the particles moving out due to capillary effect and the particles getting pinned there. And I'm not going to go too much into details of this. So, but you can understand that if I have particles and if I reduce the concentration of milk, that is, I'm increasing the amount of water, which is basically what dilution is, you can see how the droplet dried pattern changes. When I have more particles are pushed to the edge, meaning that this outer ring is thick. When there is more water, this ring is going to be thin. So you can already see where we are going with this. This was a very good sensor. So by looking at the pattern, I know whether my milk has a large number of particles or not. So if I have a milkman supplying milk to me, and I'm not sure if it's been excessively diluted, all that I need to do is to check for the drop which dries, and I'll be able to predict this. Right. So the uniformly packed region, is because of the circular, because the different sizes of particles which are held together. Remember that milk consists of a large number of particle sizes. A circular flow is generated from the lower surface tension region to the higher surface tension region, which we discussed. And so you have a combination of large and small particles which are trying to move outward and move inward. So you end up having these uh, particles which can't move anywhere. So they just stay and then fall to the surface and form a uniform region. And the empty space at the center is because of the pressure that the fluid has, and it pushes the particles, so the center region remains empty. So you have a very small number of particles in the center and give rise to. So if the flow is outward, then the center is empty. If the flow is inward, then it forms a bump. So both are equally uh, understandable. So the central bump is seen for up to 30% concentration, and then it goes to the central empty region. So you can see a flipping of the direction of molecular flow in this. So by looking at the image, we are able to predict that. And the presence of concentric rings tells us many things. First of all, it's because of the variation in the particle size, and the kind of particles, the charge on the particles also matters in either making them stick to the surface or when they're not sticking to the surface. That's for dilution, which I went in detail. So the next one is coagulation. Since this is not really about the physics of it, I'm not going to be going into the details. But you can see that when I take coagulation, and when I say coagulation, I mean something like making the curd, dahi. So initially, we have the patterns looking this way, and as the coagulation happens, there's an intermediate stage and the final stage. So you can, one thing I would like you to notice is that the pattern of dilution is very distinct from the pattern of coagulation. I mean, they're just not the same ones anywhere. And that gives us the idea that this optical visualization could help to create a sensor out of these, right? Um, so this is where the milk is in a stable form, and this is where the flocks are formed. They're beginning to coagulate, and this is when the full coagulation happens. So you have distinct patterns that are there. I'm not again going into the details of formation of fractals and other things. This is a highly interesting study. And when it comes to staling, which is the third one, you can again see that the patterns are completely different. I would, what I would urge you to see is not necessarily why they form, which we have some understanding of, not completely, but just compare these patterns. For example, what you see on this slide with what you see on this slide, which is for coagulation, and what you see on this slide, which is for dilution. They don't look anything similar. Right, so this is dilution, this is coagulation, and this is from the staling. So this is where I think the power of artificial intelligence can be used to create something which will help us predict what kind of a process the milk is undergoing. This is summarizing all that I've been saying, that you have casein and calcium and fat in the central region, the lactose salts and casein and calcium phosphate form the outer ring, and the outermost ring is lactose and salts, so on and so forth. So this is the understanding we have. Now, I should tell you that the drawback of this particular study is that because a droplet drying is highly complex, you can't pinpoint to every facet of the pattern that's formed, which means you just know that these are the patterns, but there is no way of really predicting what happens. So you need to be looking at something beyond the normal study or the human eye to know the hidden patterns. And this is what we use in the term that's used when you talk about machine learning. We wanted to find a way of tracing these hidden patterns. And that was the motivation for us to be looking at machine learning. So we see that the images formed by drying droplets, drying colloidal droplets of milk are very characteristic of the process that they are undergoing, whether it's dilution or coagulation or staling, and also the time in the process. I mean, you must have noticed that there is a timeline to the entire thing. There is an understanding of patterns formed from the physics, but it's really not fully understood. So there were two questions we were asking. Can we have a better understanding of the patterns that are formed? And can we make use of this understanding to formulate or at least to conceptualize a sensor? We are still in the concept stage. We have not been able to do it. So what we did was take the pattern. So take any one of these images that was created and and the process can be split into 5 stages. That is, there is a pre-processing of the image. That is, we take the image and then pixelate it, create a numerical value, create a grid and create a numerical value, build a neural network, feed this data into the neural network, validate the neural network's performance on some of the data that is there, and then finally try to get an output. So this is just very broad way of putting this. These are just some technical data. We have used a feed-forward algorithm where there are weights. Let me see. I'll come back to this in a minute. So let me just explain this and go back. So what we have in our study is we have a bunch of input. These inputs are the digitized data of every image. So we take the image and then convert it into numbers, and these are the data that are given. The algorithm has what we have used has two hidden layers. These are called hidden layers because it's like a black box. So we give the input, we collect the output, we have no idea how this works. And that's true for all of artificial intelligence. We have two layers, and you can change the weight that you associate with each of these layers, each of the nodes. And this data gets processed and it is put into the 3 bins, that is dilution, coagulation, and scaling. So what we do, because remember we said it was supervised learning, which means I give an image initially and I tell the program that, look, this is an image from dilution. Learn it, learn something from it. What you learn, I don't know. So I feed it a large number of images. I feed a large number of images from dilution. I feed a large number of images from coagulation, so on and so forth. And then I give a random image and say, now tell me which of the 3 bins you will put it into. And that is the essential crux of what we have done. Okay, so that's almost a summary of what we have done. So we use what is called a feed forward algorithm or neural network, because you can see that this is only going forward. There is no feedback loop. And we give the input and pick the output. There are cases where there is a feed backward. So that is, you start with the output and then find the input. Ours is like we give the input and try to determine the output. So it's called a feed forward algorithm, where weights are associated with each node. These are the nodes, and we have weights associated with them. And the network is iterated to minimize the loss function. I'll be defining the functions very shortly. The color of the pixel, you convert, basically when I take a confocal laser image, it's green and black. So that's turned into a grayscale, and then it's turned into a grid of numbers. And we normalized it, the grayscale between 0 and 1. And the neural network had 2 hidden layers of 128 nodes each. And so here these are the 3 output, but these layers have 128, and this has 249 images that we get. So the input layer has 249, the 2 intermediate layers had 128 nodes, and the final one has my 3 output bins. And so that's the complexity of the problem that is being solved. For those of you who want or know the technical details, these are the details of how we did it. It was using an Adam optimizer for gradient descent with for finding the image, for running the algorithm. The validation was done using an accuracy matrix, which I'll be discussing on Google Colaboratory. This was done during the pandemic with us sitting with, my student who was working on this was sitting with, I think, barely 2G connectivity on a mobile phone. So the whole thing we had done using cloud computing on Google Colaboratories. And it was done using Python, using the TensorFlow and OpenCV libraries. So we had to optimize what we had. So this work, the image collection happened just before the pandemic, but the entire machine learning AI aspect of it happened during the pandemic. So this is a pandemic paper for me. So how the system actually works is you have this kind of accuracy matrix, or sometimes it's called, I think, I forget it. There's another name for this. Uh, so you give an input and then it predicts, and then you start looking at the combination and define the sensitivity, accuracy, so on and so forth based on this kind of a matrix, and then try to eliminate as much as you can the false negatives and false positives, and try to get an accuracy. What we were able to achieve was about 85% accuracy. So this is what it does. It takes an image, it predicts, and then calculates these values and sees how good it is. And what we do is to tweak with the weights and see the best accuracy that we can get. And we were able to push it to about 85%. So we call for the images in the three classes: valuation, scaling, and coagulation, and assigning the category names and converting them into numerics, performing the pre-processing, which is to normalize the images into a numerical array, building a neural network. Keras is a slightly higher level of a package than TensorFlow. Designing the neural network and amending the models, validating, and if you are happy with the results, okay. Otherwise, go and tweak with the model. So each of the pixel data is taken as the initial value. The neural network then passes. I mean, this is just inverse whatever I have discussed. So I think I can actually skip this. That is, you go from one layer to the other, and after it has made some decisions, it gives out into one of the three bins, and you kind of tell it whether the prediction is correct or wrong. If the prediction is wrong, it goes back and then recorrects itself, so on and so forth. So we had 249 images, and we were able to, what we did was 70% of this, of the 249, that is 174 images, were used to train the network. So for 174, we told the algorithm whether it was tailing or dilution or coagulation, and said, okay, now go train yourself. And then the rest of the data, about 75 images, were used as a test. And that is where my 85% is based on. So out of the 75 images, 85% were correctly classified. That's what I mean by the sensitivity or the accuracy of this particular algorithm. Um, so this is the 85% that I've been talking about. Now, the reason why it was 85% was because now we have a huge complexity in the problem, that there are three different phenomena that we are talking about. So the output is three, not one, right? We should have had ideally larger number of data points. Ideally, what we were looking for, sorry, um, we had two practical limitations in the sense that our confocal was not working for some time, and by the time it started working, COVID came and we were under lockdown. If we increase the 249 images to a larger value, we'll be able to increase this efficiency. That's number one. Number two, uh, for each of the stages of tailing or coagulation, if I can increase the number of times are repeated and allow the network to actually pick up the patterns, hidden patterns, then we might even be able to predict the time, like whether this is 3 hours after coagulation, or 3 hours into tailing or whatever. So this is the concept that we have proved, but it works really well, and there is no reason to believe otherwise. Similar studies have been done with blood, on for diseases, so on and so forth. So this is not fully new. The concept is not fully new. So ideally, what we would like to do in future is to take this forward and create some kind of a smart phone-based sensor. Um, that is, can I have an app on my phone where you put a drop of milk at your home, take an image, and it tells you whether it is stale milk or it's going to be spoiled. So that was the whole motivation for doing this. And I think as a concept, it has been successful. Um, we do look forward to take it forward from here. So this work, I had purposefully kept my talk to about an hour because I would like to interact with you. I think I'm in an hour, 10 minutes. I want to be able to interact with all of you rather than just talking. This work was based, we started long time ago with Shravya, who worked on the pH-induced coagulation in dairy milk in 2006. Ashwini is my research scholar who has been instrumental in doing the experimental work. It's predominantly her thesis work. And Saban, he was my project student, but he worked on microwave diathermy simulations using finite element method when he did a project. it so happened that he went into data analysis and we started talking to each other, and we got excited, and he did most of the, I mean, in fact, he did all of the machine learning part. So this is the paper that I was talking about. It has been accepted into the Journal of Dispersion Science and Technology. Still not assigned a page number, but that's the DOI, so you can go and check it out if you want for the rest of the details. Extreme thanks for a very patient listening. I hope I've been able to communicate something with all of you, and my special thanks to Mizoram University, which is like homecoming for me. Department of ECE, again, a department that I feel strongly associated with, and special thanks to Dr. Niladri. Thank you. Okay, I can see a question which says, why we use TensorFlow? No, what can we use Cascade? I didn't understand the question. Could you please, can you please expand on that, because I didn't understand. Dr. Maiti?
Yes, ma'am. Hello.
Yeah, so you can maybe ask for a Q&A. Yeah, hi. You can maybe go for a question answers. There is one question, but I don't understand the question. Explain about TensorFlow. I mean, I don't know if I should be taking that for. Okay. Thank you. I'll come back to Gaurav Pandey. See, let me put it this way. TensorFlow is a free form of implementing ML on cloud. I don't think either this, the session is sufficient for dealing with TensorFlow completely, or is the intention of this particular thing. So I'm not comfortable with going in deep into the question. Because I mean, I need to go into all the algorithmic details for it. It's a machine learning platform. I don't know what else to say at this stage without going into the details. Niladri, any questions? Because
Any questions you have?
one thing I would suggest to Gaurav Pandey is you can always write to me, because it's a slightly longer, not slightly, much longer discussion. I believe I did share my email ID at the end of the talk, but if you have not noticed, it is there. You can always write to me and we can have a discussion. So that's
Madhurima@cutn.ac. Yes, ma'am. Every time I am also in the WhatsApp group also, and also I am telling that if you have any you can contact personally also, no problem.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. No, it's just that TensorFlow is just on one hand, it's freeware that's available. On the other hand, if you want to go into the details, it's a much longer conversation, which I don't think I can do in the next 10 minutes.
Yes. So I think
I would like to get some questions or feedback from the rest of them, because that was the intention.
Actually, feedback, ma'am, they will give to the directly AICTE website.
No, not that feedback. That's not the feedback. I'm saying,
yes,
discussion
yes,
feedback.
Yes. So you can discuss and you can question and answer, and or chat. You can chat it or question and answer.
Yeah, absolutely. You can chat.
Yeah, you can chat it, and also question answer session is there. You can give.
Thank you for. Well, I would leave it to you, Dr. Niladri, to make a call.
Yes. So there is no question.
New emerging research area.
New emerging research area.
New emerging research area. Very true. See, please share PPT. let me see how much of data I can share, because I think most, let me just confirm with my scholar and share the PPT, because if there is any unpublished data, then I'll have to be a bit careful. But I would say, on the other hand, you can always read the paper. The paper has everything, but I can share the rest of the PPT. I can share. I have no problem. So give me a couple of days to check if there's any unpublished data. I'll just delete that and share the PPT. Absolutely, why not? That can be done. Yeah, no, I was saying that this is a emerging area. That is true, because sensors, as even I think even from the time I started teaching, in 1999, 98, 1998, to my first batch of ECE students ever in my life, sensors, transducers were like completely distinct objects, and we only spoke of them as distinct entities. And over the last 20 years, this has all become so blended, and now it's very difficult to figure out where sensors end and where transducers begin, where the feedback, because this used to be very distinct, right? If you have a feedback, you call it something. If you don't have a feedback, you call it something else. And today we are all confused. So yes, it is emerging. And the nice thing about using artificial intelligence is the ability to actually find these hidden patterns. So how you implement it is up to you. Like I said, we were constrained a lot because of the COVID, extreme constraints because of COVID. Uh, but that being said, I think it should also, at least to me, it was inspiring that despite COVID, we were able to do. You know, sitting at home, we were able to do.
I can add just only that artificial intelligence in India, we are not till much. We have started research actually, but artificial intelligence is coming. After 5 years, you can think that artificial intelligence is the one of the biggest, means topmost subject for the research, because other developed countries, they have already started good research in the artificial intelligence.
Very true, very true. And the other field where this particular work that we have discussed, droplet drying, has been implemented, although not fully successfully, but people have tried, is as a uh, field level checking of diseases. Because if you are anemic, if you are cancer, if blood changes and that drying pattern changes. So if any one of you can work on some of these sensors, it will be a great idea, because you can actually create something that's going to be absolutely useful. And the concepts are there. People have worked. It's not like a dark area. There are enough papers that you can refer to, and people have done the work. So using artificial intelligence and ML along with experiment is something that people have done. Any predictive analytics related? What Kumuda, what do you mean by predictive analytics? What exactly do you mean by that? See, basically, I'm a physics person, so I mean, some of these terminologies are new to me. So please excuse me for that. Applications, like, I mean, if you see the entire work that I discussed, in a sense, isn't it predictive? Predictive could be in two ways. Like when you talk about the milk, maybe it's not really predictive, but the other example I was giving, I'm going to stick to the work that I'm doing just to give a sense of what it is that when you take a blood drop, we have found, actually I have samples sitting right in my cupboard right now. We have found that the drying droplet pattern can indicate an onset of cancer. So is that not a predictive application? Artificial intelligence for predictions, I think in finance sector is being used enormously, stock markets and finance and weather monitoring and all this. See, the bottleneck or the limiting of idea point of any of these is that you need enormous data and you need accurate data. I mean, this is where the accuracy of the data becomes extremely important. Again, I need help in translating these technical terms. Machine default, system collapse. Maybe you can unmute and ask Kumuda. Could you just unmute and ask? Maybe that's easier for both of us. I mean, I would love to answer, but I'm really unable to get a feel for what is being asked. Not able to unmute. Okay. Or if anybody else can explain what is this machine default or Niladri, I can only ask you. Do you understand this? I see. Predictive in terms of mechanical failures, yes, can be done. Like applications, yes, I understand that you're talking about applications, but okay. If you're talking about the predictive ability of artificial intelligence in any stream, yes, finances you have. Machine breakdown, again, I need to know the cause and effect. See, let me very quickly just take you to what I was, predictive analysis of machine health. Yes, okay. I think I have a slightly better understanding of what you're asking, but let me, just give me a second, please. I would like to just share this. So let's go to the sorry for this, but just give me a second. I'm trying to find the slide. Yeah. See, all of what we are, all of machine learning or artificial intelligence can be given by this particular idea. You know, if there is a feedback, you go from the output to the input. If it's a feed forward network, this is this. Feed backward is the other way around. But it gives you an idea of what these are about. So suppose you are looking at machine failure. What are you going to give as your input parameters? And what is the output you're looking at? If you have enough data to train, you say that every time the temperature falls or raises above a certain temperature, my machine fails. So you collect the data. You say that every time the amount of lubricant in my machine goes below this level, there is a failure. You need to actually formulate your question in that way. In our case, we needed to formulate that the pattern for coagulation falls into this category and for valuation into that. So this input data is what determines your output. So where can you use it? You can use it anywhere you like, because this is a black box. This is almost like asking, what can the human brain process? Because we can process language, we can process mathematics, we can process art, we can process anything provided you're given the training to it. Right? And neural networks are based on how human neural networks work. So yes, you can use it for any kind of a prediction that you want, and they have been used. If you look at the applications, they have been used. The only reason I'm hesitant to be answering these questions, both about the TensorFlow and this, was because I'm not a computer science person. I think this is better answered if you speak to a computer science person. Although I can speak as a person who uses it as an application. To give a simple answer, yes, it can be used. You need to know what your inputs are. You need to be very clear of the cause and the effect, like what is the input and what is the output. And once you have enough number of data points to train the network will pick up the patterns. I hope at least, okay, thank you. That's nice. Yeah. So any other questions or comments? I'd be happy to take.
No question, ma'am. Actually, any other, again, another one has given. Okay. Yes, no question, ma'am. So thank you, ma'am, for your kind help also, and that agreed to give the talk in this FDP. So thank you, and have a nice day, ma'am. So we'll close up. We will close up this session, and after 2:30, again 2:30. We'll start another session, and there also another distinguished professor, Professor N.R. Nikhil Ranjan Das from University of Calcutta. So he'll give some talk about these optical sensors. So we can wind up now. Ma'am, thank you again, and we'll.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and to all the participants for patiently listening to me. If there is anything that I can help, please
Yes.
don't hesitate to write.
Yes.
Thank you.
You can talk directly also. Okay. Okay. Thank you.